He was just a file number in a system built to forget, muzzled, motionless, moments from vanishing. No name, no past, only the cold stamp of failure on his record. They called him dangerous, broken, disposable. But none of them saw the fire buried beneath his silence. None until a man stepped forward, hands rough with oil, eyes heavy with grief, and spoke a name the dog shouldn't have known, yet turned to. What you're about to witness isn't a rescue, it's a reckoning. Of memory, of mercy, of what happens when something built to obey chooses to remember. Stick around, and before we dive in, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and which moment do you think changes everything? It was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, not from the air but from the quiet. The kind that makes fluorescent lights buzz louder, makes every footstep echo as though the world forgot how to fill in the silence. Out on the outskirts of Fayette Hollow, a small, weather-worn holding facility sat like a forgotten thought. No sign out front, just a patchy lawn, peeling paint, and a rusting chain-link fence that curled like it had given up resisting the years. Inside, rows of kennels lined the long hallway, occupied by barking, whining, pacing dogs, except for one. The cage near the far end held a different presence. Still, heavy, silent. The German Shepherd inside was larger than most. His coat, a deep, rich black and tan, looked clean but dull, like someone had tried to make him presentable just enough. He didn't bark, he didn't move, he barely blinked. His tag read, Unit K991. No name, no birth date, no notes. Just a number, like scrapped inventory waiting to be marked obsolete. The volunteers avoided his cage. They whispered when they passed. That one's off, someone once muttered, as if explaining away a chill in the air. He's not like the others, he's waiting. But for what, no one ever said. Some figured he was just one of those dogs, the kind that came back from some Black Ops nightmare and never really returned. Others didn't ask. They just fed him and moved on, eyes averted. Dogs didn't usually scare them. This one did, but not because he was dangerous, because he looked like he knew something. On this particular Saturday, the holding center buzzed louder than usual. Flyers had gone out across the county, public canine transfer and disposal viewing. It sounded clinical, but everyone knew what it really meant. Some dogs would be adopted, most wouldn't. Those who failed their evaluations or were retired with behavioral issues would be to humane disposal, a euphemism in a clean font. The event drew in families, curious onlookers, and maybe a few bleeding hearts looking for a cause. Among them was a man who didn't fit the scene. Elijah Boone walked through the doors like someone who had promised himself he wouldn't. A black man in his late 30s, lean but worn down by years of heavy lifting, physical and emotional. He wore a denim jacket stained with oil, jeans frayed at the knees, and boots that had walked further than most cars could drive. His hands were calloused, and his expression said he wasn't here for any real reason, at least not one he could admit to himself. Elijah passed dogs with excited barks and wagging tails, none of which he looked at for more than a second. He didn't smile at the families, didn't nod at the volunteers. He just kept walking, pulled by something he hadn't even decided to follow. Then he stopped. The air around cage, it felt weighted. The dog's stillness mirrored something deep in him, a part of himself Elijah hadn't looked at in years, the part that didn't speak, the part that kept going because stopping wasn't an option. He knelt, almost without thinking, letting his gaze meet the shepherd's. Nothing happened at first, just the sound of barking in the background, children laughing, someone asking about breeds down the row. Then Elijah whispered a word he didn't know why. It wasn't a name he'd prepared. It wasn't a name he'd heard. It just came. Ranger. The shepherd blinked, and then slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. Their eyes met, and everything stopped. No bark, no growl, no sudden movement. But something changed. The dog saw him. Not just looked at him, but recognized something. Elijah's chest tightened. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe. Behind him, a volunteer noticed and stepped closer. "Sir, that one's not up for adoption. He failed out of evaluation. He's scheduled for disposal this week." Elijah didn't answer. He barely heard the words. The dog was still watching him, eyes no longer empty. They were wide, alive, and haunted. Elijah swallowed. He said the name again, Ranger. This time the dog stood. Not with aggression, not with hesitation, but with purpose. His ears perked, his legs tense not from fear but from memory, like the word had unlocked a part of him that had been sealed shut. And Elijah, kneeling in that dim hallway beside a cage with rusted hinges and a number for a name, suddenly understood. He hadn't just found a dog, he'd awakened a secret. Ranger's head pressed gently into Elijah's chest, the weight of him unfamiliar and yet impossibly right. The volunteers watching from a distance didn't say anything. The usual warnings died on their tongues. It wasn't the kind of moment you interrupted. Elijah's breath caught as the dog stayed there, unmoving, just the rise and fall of his sides against Elijah's ribs. It was like an echo of something Elijah couldn't quite place, a memory without image, a scent without source. His hand moved instinctively, brushing through the thick fur at Ranger's neck, and that's when he felt it, the sharp ridge of something hidden beneath the coat. Not a collar tag, not an ID. It was lodged deep under the dense hair, almost as if someone had buried it there deliberately. Carefully, Elijah dug his fingers in and pulled the object free. It was a metal tag oval the size of a guitar pick, cold and worn, not shining but dulled by time and skin and fur. No name, no military stamp, no microchip barcode, just one thing. An engraved symbol. A compass, except it was cracked straight through the center and the cardinal directions were missing. It pointed nowhere. The break ran jagged like a lightning bolt, splitting the disc. Elijah stared at it, heart thudding. He had seen that symbol before. Not recently, not in books, not in documentaries, but in a briefing years ago when he still worked defense contracts for a tech subcontractor outside Fort McPherson. The symbol wasn't official. It wasn't even acknowledged. It had shown up on a file header that vanished seconds later, one he wasn't supposed to open. But it was the kind of image that burned into memory, the kind that whispered, "You shouldn't be seeing this." Behind him, the volunteer finally broke the spell. "Sir," she said, hesitant, glancing toward the supervisor desk, "I have to ask you not to tamper with the animals." Elijah looked up, eyes still glazed over, fingers tightening on the tag. "Where did this dog come from?" he asked, but the words came out quieter than he intended. She looked unsure. "We don't have origin records on the failed units. He came in from a contract facility, I think." Elijah's jaw locked. Contract facility. Not military, not police, private off books. He stood slowly, the tag clenched in his hand, and Ranger moved with him, not needing a command. The dog stood beside him like they'd walked this way for years. "He's not up for adoption," the supervisor said, stepping over, clipboard hugged to his chest. "He's failed out, dangerous, can't be placed." Elijah met the man's eyes and said, calm and certain, "He knows me." The supervisor's face pinched. "Sir, I need you to step away from the enclosure. That dog is not to be handled." Elijah didn't move. Ranger didn't growl, didn't flinch, just stood there, alert but calm, eyes locked on Elijah like he was the only thing anchoring him to the floor. There was a shift in the room, subtle but real. People turned, families stopped their conversations. Even the barking from other dogs quieted down, as if something in the air demanded stillness. "Let me walk him," Elijah said. The supervisor blinked. "Absolutely not, that dog is on the disposal list." "Then take him off it," Elijah said. Voice scoffed. "It's not procedure. Neither is calling a nameless dog by a name and watching him remember who he is," Elijah replied. The supervisor looked uncertain. Volunteer, the younger one, stepped up quietly and offered the leash. Her eyes never left Ranger. "He hasn't let anyone near him in days, not even staff. But he's listening to you." Elijah took the leash slowly as if it might dissolve. Ranger didn't resist. He walked beside Elijah like a shadow reuniting with its owner. As they moved through the facility, heads turned. The click of the dog's nails on the linoleum floor echoed like a heartbeat. Elijah didn't know where he was going, only that he needed air. Answers. Space to breathe. Outside the sky was gray but dry, clouds pressed low like wet wool. Elijah stopped near the side of the building, crouched beside Ranger and studied the tag again. He ran his thumb over the compass, over the break. "Who did this to you?" he murmured. Ranger didn't answer, of course. But his eyes, those deep, observant eyes, watched Elijah with a stillness that wasn't dog-like at all. There was pain behind them. Not physical, not anymore. Elijah thought of his brother Elijah Jr., lost years ago in a black site rotation overseas. Officially MIA, unofficially unspoken. They'd stopped getting answers the minute the body wasn't returned. The minute the report used the word classified. Elijah hadn't thought about him in months, maybe longer. But now that name pressed at the back of his throat. He looked down at Ranger, he asked softly. And it wasn't a joke. A gust of wind kicked up dust around the concrete slab where they stood. Ranger's ears flicked back. Then he stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Elijah's shoulder, slow and deliberate. Not begging, not asking, just remembering. Elijah closed his eyes. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, snapping a picture of the tag, then another of Ranger's face. The leash rested loose in his hand now, but Ranger wasn't going anywhere. A truck pulled into the lot behind them, black, unmarked, windows tinted too dark for county vehicles. Elijah watched it for a long second, gut tightening. The engine idled. No one stepped out. He grabbed the leash. "Come on," he whispered. Ranger moved beside him instantly, like it had been drilled in. Not obedience, reflex. They walked back toward the parking lot. Elijah didn't look back at the truck, but Ranger did. And for the first time, Elijah saw a low growl vibrate in the dog's throat, quiet. Almost inaudible, but not from fear. From memory, from recognition. They didn't stop walking. Elijah's keys jingled in his jacket pocket as they reached his old Chevy parked out front. Ranger jumped in without hesitation, curling on the passenger seat like he'd done it 100 times before. Elijah sat behind the wheel, the tag still clutched in his hand, his pulse ticking louder than the engine. He didn't know what was waiting for them down the road, but he was starting to suspect that someone else did. Elijah's truck grumbled to a stop in the gravel lot behind his garage. The old Chevy still breathing heavy from the ride back through town. The clouds had lowered since morning, rolling across the sky like smoke, and the wind had picked up just enough to make the old wind chimes rattle like bones. Inside the cab, Ranger remained seated, his body still turned, but his ears twitching at every shift of sound. Elijah reached over to unclip the leash, but Ranger didn't move. He just stared out the window, fixed on something past the rusted fence line. Elijah followed the gaze and saw it. A black SUV parked 200 meters up the road. The vehicle didn't belong to anyone on their side of the block. No county emblem, no license plate in the front, just the kind of government gray paint and deep tint that whispered, "Don't ask." Ranger's throat released a low growl, rumbling like the slow start of an earthquake. Elijah had heard it once before, years back, in Afghanistan, when a bomb-sniffing dog recognized a shape no human could see. But this wasn't about smell. This was something else. Elijah placed a hand gently on Ranger's neck. "Easy," he said, but the tension under the fur didn't ease. His fingers touched the edge of the metal tag again, still warm from his pocket. And the weight of it felt heavier now, more deliberate, like a key he hadn't yet found the lock for. The SUV idled for another moment, then pulled away slowly, tires crunching gravel with the kind of patience that only came from people who had all the time. Elijah didn't breathe until it disappeared behind the curve. Later that afternoon, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Dr. Vera Mercer answered on the second ring, her voice sharp, brisk, but not unfriendly. "Elijah Boone," she said flatly. "The hell do you want after 5 years of radio silence?" "I need a scan run," Elijah said, "on a dog." Pause. Then a sigh. "That the same dog who showed up on the local shelter list this morning." "Yeah, word travels fast, even in the woods." "Fine, bring him in. But if he bites my receptionist, I'm calling you to clean the floor." Elijah smiled for the first time that day. He won't bite. The clinic was a converted farmhouse set just outside Slate Ridge and shielded by pine trees older than the road. The inside still smelled like cedar shavings and antiseptic. Ranger stepped across the threshold without resistance, but Elijah could feel the way the dog's posture shifted low, careful, measuring every creak of the old floor. Dr. Mercer was waiting near the back hallway, hair tied up in a red bandana, glasses hanging low on her nose. She took one look at Ranger and her face changed. "This one's been through hell," she muttered. "And it wasn't the kind of hell nature makes." Elijah said nothing. He followed as she led them to the examination room, where the scanner sat ready on the table. She gestured. Ranger obeyed without hesitation. A practiced hop like he'd done it 100 times before. As Dr. Mercer ran her hands over his torso, Elijah saw her face tighten. Her fingers paused just below the left shoulder blade. "There," she murmured. "Something under the skip location." The screen flashed white, then black, and then shut down completely. "What the?" Mercer stepped back, staring at the dead machine. "That shouldn't happen. This scanner's not even 5 months old." Elijah stepped forward. "You've seen that before?" "Not from anything that came from a shelter," she said. "This isn't military. This isn't even standard tech. This..." She turned to her desk, rummaging through a drawer until she found an older model scanner. One used for live scanner. One used for livestock, the kind that read at deeper frequencies. She tried again. This time the screen didn't even turn on. She looked at Elijah, her voice dropping. "Whatever's inside him, it's shielded. And whatever shielding they use, it's disrupting the hider. That's not for tracking." Ranger stayed perfectly still, as if he knew exactly what they were trying to find. "Do you know who did this to him?" she asked. "No," Elijah said. "But I think someone's looking for him, and I think they know I have him." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "This isn't good. If the chip's this deep and this encrypted, they didn't want him found." The Stachel fashioned shop at a distance, Tony, but no one answered. Elijah's head jerked as if he wanted to confront his usual. She studied the broken compass, her face pale. "I've seen this before," she whispered. "Once, back when I worked part-time for a private research arm that contracted for defense. They never gave us names, just files, codes. One day I got called in to look at a dog with odd neurological patterns. Too sharp, too reactive, but completely controllable under certain frequencies. I wasn't told where it came from, but this symbol was stamped on the containment file." "You happened to the dog?" Elijah asked. She hesitated. "It didn't survive the final test." Elijah's stomach tightened. He looked at Ranger. The dog didn't look back. He was staring at the window, watching. Mercer set the tag down carefully. "Elijah," she said slowly, "you need to be careful. If this is what I think it is, that dog's not just a rescue, he's a classified project with a tail." Outside, a car passed on the road. Not fast, not slow, but deliberate. Elijah's eyes followed the shape through the blinds. Back inside the exam room, Ranger shifted on the table. Not nervous, not agitated, just alert. Elijah clenched his fists. "I'm taking him with me." Dr. Mercer nodded. "I'd do the same." Elijah turned to leave, but Mercer grabbed his arm. "If someone comes asking..." Ranger hopped into the truck. Elijah slid behind the wheel and started the engine. They didn't speak. Not that it mattered, because neither of them needed words to feel what was coming next. The road ahead twisted, narrow, and quiet. The kind of path that hides things just out of reach. Elijah tightened his grip on the wheel as a figure stepped out from behind a tree at the edge of the road. Arm raised, not in threat, but the man on the roadside wasn't holding a weapon, wasn't threatening, just standing there, one arm lifted in a half-waved, half-hustler's foot. Elijah's foot eased off the gas, his body tightening as he pulled the truck to a slow stop. The man approached the driver's side window, his movements cautious, not aggressive, middle-aged, wearing a faded jacket with grease stains down the sleeve, a trucker cap pulled low over his eyes. "You Elijah Boone?" he asked, voice gravel-scratched and low. Elijah nodded slowly. "You with the shelter?" the man asked again. Elijah didn't answer right away. "Who's asking?" The man looked around like the trees had ears. "You got the shepherd with you, right?" Elijah's silence was answer enough. The man handed over a small envelope, sealed with brown tape, no marking. "This came to my mailbox, I don't know why. I didn't open it. But if you're who I think you are, you need to see what's inside." He didn't wait for thanks, just turned and walked off into the trees like he was never meant to be part of the scene. Elijah watched him vanish, then turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper felt oddly stiff, like it had been frozen and thawed. He opened it in the truck with Ranger sitting upright in the passenger seat, eyes locked forward like a sentinel. Inside was a photo, grainy, aged, clearly printed from an old digital file. It showed Ranger same coat, same stance, but younger, leaner, wearing tactical armor stamped with a code Elijah didn't recognize. He stood beside a soldier in full combat gear, face blurred digitally, not by accident but by intention. The blur had been done after the fact, rough, smeared like someone was hiding something fast. But the soldier's body was visible enough. The frame, the posture, the slight bow in the left shoulder. Elijah's breath hitched. He'd seen that stance before, in family photos, in grainy VHS tapes from the 90s, in a coffin that never opened because the military had claimed there was no body to return. The resemblance was uncanny, too close to ignore. Elijah gripped the edge of the envelope tighter as the truck idled in the growing wind. He turned the photo over. Nothing written, no hint, just a smear of black ink near the edge, like a gloved thumb had pressed there too hard. Back at the garage, Elijah cleared space on the workbench, laid the photo down under a lamp, and scanned it with his phone. The metadata was stripped. No file history, no timestamp, nothing traceable. But the background, he studied it closely. Mountains, barren, a structure with white panel siding and numbers on the door barely visible. 12-bet. That matched nothing public. The shape of the terrain felt familiar. He'd seen similar ridgelines in satellite data while working on geothermal surveys near decommissioned bases. He dug out his old hard drive, the one from his contracting days, and spent the next hour scrolling through maps until he found it. An abandoned facility in northern Arizona, listed as deconstructed since 2014. Poor Douglas remained in silence. Standing in the coordinates matched the building in the photo. 12. Ranger sat behind him, tail still, eyes on the garage door like he was waiting for something Elijah couldn't see. "You been there, haven't you?" Elijah asked quietly. Ranger didn't respond, but something in his ears shifted subtle, like he'd heard something no one else could. Elijah opened a new file on his laptop, dumped in the photo, mapped the coordinates, started a folder he labeled Ranger Echo. He pulled out the tag again, turned it over in his fingers, then reached into the toolbox for a small screwdriver. Under the harsh light, he noticed the edge of the tag wasn't solid. It had a seam. With careful pressure, he twisted the blade until the tag popped open like a locket. Inside was not a second engraving, not a tracking device, but a wafer-thin data chip, embedded like a time bomb inside a memory vault. His hands went cold. He slipped the chip into a port adapter and fed it into his laptop. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen flashed, flickered, and a folder appeared. D/echo_91/behave_test/log_17. The log was a raw audio file, no visuals. He pressed play. A voice barked commands in military cadence. Target acquired, K-91, engage. There was silence. Then a second voice, not electronic, not human either, digitally enhanced, deep with static. K-991, stand by. Engage target. Another pause. The first voice shouted again, more urgent. Execute protocol. Then came another voice, distorted, but definitely not synthetic. It was human. It was panicked. "There's a kid. There's a goddamned kid behind the target." A scuffle. A muffled bark. Then the digital record crackled into something unscripted. "Abort," a new voice muttered. He didn't fire. He broke rank, then static, then silence. Elijah leaned back in his chair, breath shallow. His heart pounded like thunder trapped inside a drum. He looked at Ranger, who was now standing, not barking, not pacing, just staring at the speakers like the audio had unlocked something behind his eyes. Elijah whispered, "They gave you a command to kill, didn't they?" His voice trembled, not from fear but from awe. "And you chose not to." He turned back to the screen. Another file had appeared, auto-extracted. A heavily encrypted document labeled disciplinary_echo 991_. He clicked. The contents were redacted, black bars swallowing every line but one at the bottom. Subject K-991 displayed aberrant autonomy in combat scenario. Failure to comply, emotional interference observed. Recommend disposal or data strip. He froze. The term emotional interference wasn't standard military language. It meant something else. It meant refusal. Elijah pulled out a notebook and wrote the words down, circled them. "You made a choice," he said again, louder this time. And Ranger blinked once. slow and deliberate. A hard knock jolted the moment. Elijah tensed, closed the laptop fast, tucked the chip back into the tag and the tag into his pocket. He opened the garage door a crack. No one. Just the wind. But pinned to the outside of the door with a thumbtack was another envelope. This one was heavier. Inside, a flash drive. He stared at it, breath coming short, as Ranger rose slowly, ears tilted forward. One paw hovering slightly off the ground like he was poised to move, not because of a command, but because of something else stirring just beneath the surface. The flash drive felt heavier than it should, like whatever secrets it carried added weight to the plastic. Elijah stood motionless in the doorway, the night pressing in around him, the soft electric hum from his laptop screen behind him now muffled by the sudden stillness. He closed the garage door slowly, tucked the envelope into his jacket, and glanced at Ranger, who remained near the center of the room, head tilted just slightly, eyes locked on Elijah's hands as if sensing the shift in gravity. No label, no return address, no sign of origin, just like the last envelope. Elijah inserted the drive into his laptop with fingers that trembled, not from fear but from something colder, older recognition. The folder opened immediately without prompt. Inside were 3 video files, numbered not titled. He clicked the first. Grainy footage flickered to life, no timestamp, no color correction, but clearly taken from a body cam or helmet feed. It showed a K9 unit, unmistakably Ranger, wearing the same tactical armor as in the photo. The angle followed a hallway dusty, half-lit with gunfire echoing somewhere off-camera. Commands barked in short, clipped phrases. Hold right, breach left, K9 advance. Ranger moved with surgical precision, no hesitation. He cleared corners faster than the men behind him. Then, just as he reached a junction, the camera jolted. The voice shouted, "Fire on target, green light confirmed." And in the frame, a small figure darted across the hallway. A child, crying. Arms up, he froze. Snarl caught in his throat. The video stuttered. Someone screamed. The feed cut. Elijah slammed the laptop shut. His heart raced like it was trying to outrun memory. He stood and paced the garage, every footstep echoing too loud. Ranger remained near the wall, breathing steady but eyes wide. Elijah pulled out his old Bluetooth speaker, powered it up from muscle memory, and scrolled through a playlist stored on an ancient phone he hadn't touched in years. He stopped at one title, Midnight Train to All Thanksgiving to Midnight Train. It had been one of Elijah Jr.'s favorites. They used to play it back at the base in makeshift poker games, whenever the silence between assignments grew too loud. The first notes rang out, slow guitar licks wrapped in southern grit and sorrow. As the chorus began, Ranger stiffened. His ears pricked straight, his front legs shifted apart slightly. His breathing changed deeper, quicker, but not panicked. Elijah froze, watching. Ranger began to pace, not randomly, not erratically, but in a defined, measured pattern. 4 steps forward, 2 left, pause, bibbit. 4 steps again. Elijah's breath caught. That pattern, that movement. It wasn't just pacing, it was a patrol path. Back in their compound overseas, Elijah Jr. had a weird habit. He always walked his late-at rounds in a loop L shape. Said it helped him clear blind corners without spooking the ghosts. Elijah had teased him about it, called it the bootleg tango. But now, watching Ranger retrace the exact same formation across the stained concrete floor, he wasn't laughing. Ranger did it 3 times. On the 4th round, he stopped in the corner, right beside the utility sink, and began scratching the ground. Not digging, scratching, deliberate, repetitive. Elijah approached slowly. Ranger didn't growl, didn't flinch, just kept working. Elijah knelt beside him and watched as the scratches took form. Letters, uneven, jagged, shallow, but letters nonetheless. He read them aloud under his breath. He did not look. Elijah stared at the message, the ache in his chest blooming like a bruise. "Who didn't?" he whispered. Ranger turned to look at him, eyes dark and shining with something that wasn't just intelligence. It was memory straining to speak without words. Elijah ran a hand through his hair, stood and backed away. He opened the second video file. This time the footage was aerial drone captured, with thermal overlays. It showed a compound, square-shaped, low buildings clustered near a mountainside. A small firefight erupted near the southeast entrance. A single soldier ran across the Fia zone, followed closely by Ranger. A bright explosion flared at the edge of the screen, knocking the soldier forward. The dog stopped, turned, doubled back toward the flames. The screen blinked. Playback ended. Elijah exhaled. That soldier, he whispered, voice cracking. That was him, wasn't it? He didn't need an answer. He played the final video. This one was in color. Close up, the camera was pointed directly at Ranger, restrained in a steel enclosure. A figure behind the camera spoke in cold, clinical tones. Subject K991 remains unresponsive to secondary command override. Audio triggers ineffective. Subject exhibits behavior associated with trauma lock and abnormal imprinting. Will proceed with Protocol 8C memory fracture and reassignment. Initiate sedation. Then came a sound not from the speaker, but from the real dog across the room. Ranger let out a low whine. Not loud, not desperate, but broken. The kind of sound something makes when it remembers pain too large for a body its size. Elijah stood still, fists clenched. They tried to wipe you. His voice shook. They broke you on purpose. Ranger lowered his head, touched Elijah's shin with his nose gently, like a tether seeking ground. In the stillness that followed, Elijah went to the cabinet, pulled out an old file case from his military years. Inside were folders, photos, deployment records. He flipped through them until he found the grainy black and white roster from Elijah Jr.'s final rotation. 3rd Recon. Phoenix teams, listed, only 4 returned. He scanned the names, then paused. One of the returnees had been reassigned stateside for security observation at a defense facility in Arizona codenamed Echo Yaf, the same sector listed on the metadata from the drive. Elijah's phone buzzed. A message. No contact ID, just coordinates. And one line, he never left. He looked at Ranger. The dog didn't blink, didn't move. Elijah packed the laptop, the files, and the drive into his duffel. The playlist still looped softly. The wind picked up outside and thunder rolled in the distance. He opened the garage door, and the cold hit like a slap. Ranger stepped outside first, stopped, turned his head east. Elijah followed his gaze. The road to Arizona wasn't on any GPS, but Ranger was already walking toward it. The drive toward Arizona was long and nearly silent, the only sound in the cab coming from the hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt, and the occasional rattle from the old Chevy's dashboard. Elijah's fingers tapped the steering wheel rhythmically as he tried to process the coordinates. The message, the recordings, the image of his brother blurred in a photo that wasn't supposed to exist. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, eyes never leaving the passing terrain. But ever so often he would shift his head slightly, ears twitching as if hearing something Elijah couldn't. When they finally pulled over at a rest stop near the state border, the sun was starting to set in a blaze of red and gold across the desert sky. Elijah parked beneath the shade of a scraggly tree, stepped out to stretch his legs, and watched Ranger sniff the air, muscles coiled in quiet tension. They can linger. When they reached the outskirts of a forgotten mining town called Darrington, a place wiped off most maps in 2009, they set up camp in the back of an abandoned warehouse Elijah once helped wire for storm-resistant generators during a brief contract gig. He had a key. No one else should have had access. That night, he secured the garage doors from the inside, triple-checked the windows, and reinforced the locks on the exits. He unrolled a sleeping bag in the corner near the electrical box and set up a temporary workstation with his laptop, notebooks, and the remaining contents of the military file labeled Echo. Ranger curled near the far wall, back to the exit, always watching, always positioned to intercept. Around 2 a.m., the wind howled through the broken eaves above, rattling metal like whispered threats. Elijah couldn't sleep. He stood and walked the perimeter with a flashlight, checking every latch again. Then he paused, something gnawing at him. The ceiling panels. One looked newer, slightly off-base. Nestled in the shadowed crawlspace was a small device the size of a matchbox, matte black with a single red LED pulsing softly. Elijah reached up, pulled it free, and held it in the light. A camera. Not consumer-grade, high-level, likely motion-activated. Except this one wasn't. He turned it over, found a tiny inscription near the battery port. Reactive mode. Biosync. Biometric synchronicity. He turned to look at Ranger. He scanned the device with his phone. The specs popped up: instantly surveillance module with passive mode triggered by specific biosignatures, namely heart rate variability. He stood in stunned silence, realization sliding into place like a loaded chamber. The camera had been calibrated to activate only when Ranger's heart rate crossed a certain threshold: fear, aggression, memory recall. It hadn't been watching him, it had been watching what the dog remembered. He smashed the camera against the floor, stomped it twice, then swept the pieces into a metal tray and burned them with the torch. But the bile was already rising in his throat. They'd been inside. They'd planted it. Someone had breached his safe space, set the trap, and left without a trace. No message, just data collection. Cold, precise, patient. Morning came with a brittle light and the sound of a vehicle approaching. Elijah peeked through the boarded window and froze. The black SUV had returned. This time it wasn't parked at a distance. It rolled slowly down the dirt path beside the warehouse and stopped just 20 feet from the main gate. The engine idled for a few seconds. Then the driver's side window lowered. Inside, the man behind the wheel wore tactical sunglasses and a clean-shaven jaw. But what drew Elijah's eye wasn't the face. It was the collar pin, small, silver, unmistakable. A compass, cracked in half, the same symbols engraved into Ranger's tag. The man made no gesture, no threat. He just sat there, one hand on the wheel, eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses, watching. Then he lifted a finger, just one, and tapped it once against the side of his temple, as if to say, "And we know what you're thinking." The SUV drove away as slowly as it had arrived. Elijah didn't chase. He closed the blinds, locked the door, turned to Ranger and whispered, "They've made contact." Later that day, Elijah wired a portable EMP emitter from spare parts and old microwave guts, rigging it to pulse in case of another breach. He placed it by the door and built a deadman trigger into his phone. If someone entered while he slept, the whole place would fry. He didn't like turning his life into a war zone, but this wasn't paranoia anymore. It was protocol. That evening, he pulled out a worn field notebook from his duffel and began sketching the sequence of events. The video logs the child Ranger refused to fire on, the surveillance, the broken compass, the blurred face, the patrol pattern, the scratch message, the synced camera. He began seeing patterns, not just random data, but design. All of it pointed to one central truth. Ranger had disobeyed because Ranger remembered. Not in a human way. In a way built from pain, repetition, trauma, and something far more dangerous: choice. Elijah turned on the radio to drown the silence, let it drift through static until it landed on a blues station out of Phoenix. The moment the guitar strings from an old Muddy Waters track played through the speakers, Ranger stood up abruptly, his ears pricked forward, eyes wide. Elijah stared. "That song?" he asked, moving toward the speaker. Ranger let out a short, sharp bark. Not a warning, not excitement and alert. Elijah walked to the desk, picked up the old military logbook from Elijah Jr.'s unit. The last page had a scribbled note written in smudged pencil. "Midnight patrol blues on loop, keeps the dogs from shaking." That wasn't a note for handlers, that was from Elijah Jr. himself. Elijah's breath hitched. He turned off the radio. Ranger sat back down but didn't relax. His eyes remained locked on the spot where the music had played, as if expecting something else to follow. Elijah flipped open the logbook again and noticed faint impressions on the next page, as if someone had pressed hard while writing a message, then torn out the sheet. He shaded the page lightly with graphite from a pencil. The ghost of a phrase appeared. "You're not alone in the barracks anymore." Ranger rose again, this time walking to the far side of the room, toward a spot beneath the storage shelf. He sniffed once, then began pawing at the baseboard with measured strokes. Elijah watched as the wood gave way, revealing a small, dust-caked box embedded between the studs. Inside was a strip of fabric pamo, old and faded, with a stitched patch. Elijah dropped to his knees. "You kept it," he whispered, barely audible. Ranger placed one paw on the patch, held it there like he was grounding himself. Elijah didn't cry, but something in him cracked, clean and deep. Outside, the wind shifted again. He stood, walked back to the table, and began assembling his gear. Because now, more than ever, he knew they weren't just being watched, they were being studied. The The morning sun had barely broken over the ridges when Elijah found the message taped to the garage door. No envelope this time, no warning, just a single sheet of paper folded once and pressed under a rusted nail. The handwriting was unmistakably Dr. Mercer's, but it was shaky, rushed, as if written bled through from where her hand must have pressed too hard. If anyone finds Ranger, don't trust anyone in uniform. Not military, not federal, not private. They're not here to help, they're here to erase him. And anyone who remembers what he is. There was no signature, no address, just that note and the silence that followed it. Elijah read it 3 times before crumpling it into his fist and slamming it against the metal wall. He tried calling her clinic, no answer. Drove there himself 2 hours later. The building was dark, locked, shades drawn, and the sign flipped to closed even though the posted hours said otherwise. There was no sign of forced entry, no missing pet flyers, no personal effects, no paperwork, just gone. Vanished like she'd never existed, like someone had reached in and pulled her out of the timeline. Elijah stood on the sidewalk with Ranger at his side and felt that familiar tightening behind his ribs. The one that said, this wasn't just a warning, it was a message. That evening, he dug deep into an old veterans database, one that wasn't online anymore but that he had downloaded years ago out of paranoia, or maybe just instinct. He scanned names, projects, former DoD contractors, flagged keywords. One file hit Raymond Stillwell, former systems engineer, Division Echo 9. Location unknown. He cross-referenced it with a decades-old contractor phone book, found a mailing address in a suburb north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. No phone, no email, just a faded government stamp and a scribbled post-it stuck to the file. Do not contact. Which was exactly why Elijah packed up Ranger, grabbed his notebook and drove. The house was buried behind a wall of dying pine trees, the paint peeling off the siding like skin. A broken satellite dish sat in the dirt, and wind chimes made of old shell casings clinked hollowly in the breeze. Elijah knocked, waited, knocked again. The door cracked open just enough for the barrel of a shotgun to appear. I'm not buying anything, a gravel-thick voice said. I'm not selling, Elijah replied, but I have the dog you designed a soul for. A beat passed, the door opened wider. Raymond Stillwell looked like a man who had seen too much and talked about none of it. Late 60s, gray beard, camo jacket, eyes that didn't blink until they were sure you weren't a hallucination. He let them in without another word. The interior of the house was a bunker. Blackout curtains, reinforced doors, security monitors from a closed-circuit system that probably cost more than the property itself. Ranger didn't bark, didn't sniff. He walked in like he'd been here before. Stillwell stared at him for a long minute, then sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Jesus Christ, he said under his breath. I thought they destroyed all of you. Elijah sat across from him. They almost did. Stillwell reached for a dusty file folder stashed beneath a pile of schematics. He tossed it on the table. The top sheet read, Cognitive Patterning and Tactical Animals, V3.2 Controlled Instinct Modules. He flipped to a page halfway in. What do you know? Enough to be hunted, Elijah said. Not enough to understand why. Stillwell rubbed his eyes. Echo 9 wasn't a weapons program. Not officially. It was marketed as kinetic intelligence integration. Fancy way of saying, let's make dogs feel what we tell them to kill. Only it didn't go that way. We gave them the neural layers, the reward receptors, the pattern recognition, but some of them learned too much. He pointed to a picture in the file Ranger, barely a year old, flanked by 2 handlers. One of the handlers had been Elijah Jr.'s. They called this one a mirror build. He didn't just follow commands. He bonded, synced, mirrored the emotions of the person closest to him. Most of the others broke. He didn't. He adapted. Too well, Elijah swallowed hard. So he didn't malfunction. No. Stillwell looked up, face grim. Made a choice. He pulled out a thin drive, plugged it into a secure laptop with no wireless components. This file was sealed, buried under a dead project's classification, but I kept a backup. The screen lit up with a schematic Ranger's neural map, side by side with a human EEG. The spikes overlapped almost identically. He didn't just recognize threats, Stillwell said. He evaluated context, emotional state, collateral. That incident in the hallway, he didn't freeze, he overrode the command. They punished him for that, Elijah said quietly. They didn't just punish him, Stillwell growled. They tried to erase him, wipe the memory grid, re-imprint new directives, but something in the core architecture resisted. It's like he locked the original protocol behind a firewall. Even we couldn't crack. Elijah leaned back. And now they're after him because they can't control him. They're after him, Stillwell said, because he remembers what it means not to follow orders. He stood, opened a drawer, and pulled out a sealed envelope with Elijah's name already written on it. They know who you are, who your brother was. That's not coincidence. That's connection. He's not just any dog. He's the last proof that Echo 9 created something they couldn't contain, a weapon that chose mercy. Elijah took the envelope but didn't open it yet. His voice was low. Why now? Why come back for him after all these years? Stillwell looked toward Ranger, who sat in the doorway, back straight, eyes like coals smoldering in the dark. Because some ghosts don't die when you bury the file. They die when you bury the truth. The security monitor buzzed suddenly. A shape on the driveway. Stillwell moved quickly, cued the lights, drew the curtain. Elijah crawled to the window. The SUV was back. This time it wasn't alone. Another vehicle behind it. No plates. Stillwell's voice was steel. Get out the back. Take the canyon trail. I'll stall them. Elijah grabbed the drive, the folder, the envelope. Ranger was already moving, ears low, body tight. They slipped into the shadows, breath held, footsteps silent just as the front door took its first pounding hit from a boot. They ran through the canyon trail as moonlight broke in slivers across the brush, their steps muffled by dirt and instinct. Ranger moved ahead of Elijah with a sense of purpose that required no command, his body low and agile, navigating the path like a soldier returning to an old battlefield. Behind them, distant shouts cracked the silence, 1, 2, then muffled radio static echoing against the rocks. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't have to. The files tucked against his chest felt heavier than steel, and Stillwell's last look still burned in his memory, not fear, not resignation, but the gaze of a man who knew he wouldn't survive the night and had made peace with it. They reached the edge of the trail 2 hours before dawn, packs covered and breathless, and climbed into the truck parked beneath a line of dead mesquites. Elijah twisted the key. The engine roared to life, and they peeled out without headlights, letting the desert swallow their scent and their noise. They returned to the garage the next evening, the trip taking longer with detours meant to avoid surveillance checkpoints and any vehicle that followed too long in the mirrors. The road was empty when they arrived, but Ranger was already on alert before the tires stopped turning. Elijah killed the engine and stared at the building. Nothing looked out of place. The steel doors still chained, the side window boarded, the light above the loading dock flickering like always. But Ranger didn't move. He stared at the roofline, growled low, not with aggression but warning. Elijah gripped the door handle and paused. His breath slowed. Something was wrong. The silence wasn't normal. It was waiting. That was when Ranger backed away from the passenger door and let out one sharp bark, short, urgent, direct. Elijah didn't hesitate. He reversed the truck 10 feet and threw it into park, and then the explosion hit. The sound ruptured the air like thunder thrown against steel. The roof lifted, the blast wave knocking out the side walls in a plume of fire, glass, and pulverized brick. The windows shattered into a storm of shrapnel. Heat blasted across the windshield. Elijah ducked behind the wheel, shielding his face. Ranger barked again, more of a snarl now, as if confirming that yes, that had been meant for them. The fire took 2 hours to die. By then, the fire trucks arrived, too late and too disoriented to ask questions. Elijah watched from a ridge half a mile out, binoculars trained on the site. Arson, definitely, but no investigation would follow. No news coverage, no paper trail, just another structural accident in a forgotten part of town. That night, they didn't sleep. They drove until sunrise, found a stretch of abandoned cabins near the river, and holed up in the one with the strongest locks and no line of sight from the road. Elijah changed the battery in his sat phone, dialed a number from the sealed envelope Stillwell had handed him. It rang once, then clicked. A voice on the other end whispered, "I thought you were dead." Elijah answered. The call dropped. 30 minutes later, someone knocked 2 soft taps, One long pause, one tap again. The knock sequence wasn't random. It was Echo 9's clearance code for internal entry without threat. Elijah opened the door cautiously. The man standing there wore a janitor's jacket. Same kind Elijah had seen weeks ago at the shelter. Short beard, quiet eyes, a scar beneath the left jawline that pulsed when he spoke. "I'm not here to hurt you," the man said, stepping inside slowly. "Name's Jared. You saw me cleaning cages. That wasn't my job." Elijah closed the door behind him, heart pounding. "You were at the facility?" Jared nodded. "He was the last field trainer assigned to Echo K9 before the program was shut down. I trained most of the units that didn't make it past testing. Ranger was different." Ranger stepped from the shadows without a sound. The moment Jared saw him, his breath caught. "He remembers," Jared whispered, awe breaking through his voice like a cracked mirror. "I didn't think he would. I didn't think he'd survive, let alone remember." Elijah said nothing, just waited. Jared continued, "I was there the day he chose not to fire. The kid in the hallway. The override failed. I called it a miracle." Elijah asked, "Why were you at the shelter?" Jared looked down. "After the program collapsed, most of us were discharged, blacklisted, or disappeared. I laid low, took small jobs. I heard a rumor that one Echo unit had resurfaced alive. When I saw him in that cage, I didn't believe it was real. I left before they moved in to terminate." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "So why now?" Jared pulled a small drive from his jacket, placed it on the table. "Because they're accelerating. Stillwell's gone, you're on the run, and Ranger's the last link to what they tried to bury. And now they know it." He glanced at the wall where Elijah had pinned maps, photos, printouts. "They don't care about killing the past. They care that the past knows how to speak, that he can still be proof of what they did." Elijah clenched his jaw. "You think they'll come again?" Jared nodded. "Not think, no. The explosion wasn't a warning, it was a verdict." He paused, then pointed to Ranger. "But they didn't expect him to survive it. They forgot he was trained for detection, not obedience." Ranger sat still, ears locked forward, eyes on Jared. Then he moved slow, cautious steps until he stood inches from the man. Jared reached down, palm open. Ranger sniffed once, then gently pressed his head against Jared's leg. Elijah watched, not surprised anymore. Something in Ranger responded to recognition beyond logic, beyond memory. It was something cellular, a bond reforging itself with each breath. Jared's voice dropped to a whisper. He was meant to be erased, and yet, here he is. Elijah leaned in. "So tell me what they didn't put in the files." Jared hesitated. Echo 9 wasn't just about tactical advantage. It was about removing hesitation, turning moral delay into program certainty. Ranger passed every combat test but failed every empathy suppression module. They saw that as disobedience. I saw it as evolution. Elijah sat back slowly. He was never meant to follow. He was meant to understand. Jared nodded. "And now he does." Which makes him dangerous, because if a dog can choose not to kill, then maybe humans can't hide behind orders anymore. A shadow moved past the window fast, low. Ranger's head snapped to attention. Stygia stood instantly. Jared whispered, "You've been followed." The dog's yesterday's gear tucked Barely's coat. Ranger growled low. "Not fear alert." Outside, a second knock rang out. Not the code, just a single knock, and then another, and another. The knocks grew louder, less rhythm and more warning, echoing through the rotting wood and metal of the cabin walls. As dust fell from the rafters and the wind outside howled like it had finally remembered its teeth. Elijah locked eyes with Jared, who gave a tight nod, reached under his coat, and pulled a compact sidearm from a hidden shoulder holster, then pointed toward the rear crawlspace hatch behind the shelves. Ranger was already there, his nose pressed to the ground, ears flat against his skull, body low and ready. Elijah scooped up the drive, the map, the notebook, and the last of Stillwell's envelope contents, tucked them into his pack, and followed Ranger into the shadows. Jared stayed behind, his last look a silent promise to stall whoever had come, not to fight, just to buy them time. They crawled through the tight space until it opened into a drainage culvert that led beyond the bluff. Ranger took point without hesitation, following some invisible path written in his blood, a trail he couldn't explain but refused to forget. The world narrowed to dirt, roots, and breath. When they surfaced 20 minutes later, the cabin behind them was silent. No sound of gunfire, no shouts, only the smoke rising faintly above the tree line. Jared's fate remained unanswered. But Elijah didn't have time to grieve. Ranger didn't pause. He turned east, toward the forest. Not the thick, wild expanse beyond the ridge, but the narrow, man-cleared grid of trees Elijah remembered from one photograph buried in the drive. Training Sector 001, marked decommissioned but never dismantled. They moved through the underbrush, the forest too quiet, the birds too absent, and Elijah's boots sank into soil that felt older than war. Ranger slowed near a series of rusted chain-link remnants, where vines had overtaken what used to be perimeter fencing. Beyond it, concrete pads lay cracked and stained, the remnants of kennels long since bulldozed but not erased. The air felt heavy here, as if sound had weight, and every step stirred dust from memories not entirely dead. Ranger sniffed near a mound of collapsed cinder blocks beside a half-toppled observation tower. He didn't bark. He just began to dig methodically, with paws that struck each layer like he remembered where everything had once been. Elijah joined him, pulling aside slabs and weeds, revealing what looked like the remains of a footlocker bent, scorched, nearly fused shut from fire or impact. He pried it open with his knife, and inside he found scraps of fabric, melted plastic, a burned-out comms device, and something solid wedged between two panels. It was a badge tarnished, cracked down the center, but the name etched into it, though half-eaten by time, was unmistakable. Boone E.F. His hands trembled, but blood still on the lower edge, flaked and dark but unmistakable. His breath caught somewhere between a sob and a whisper. "You were here," he said softly, staring at the piece of metal like it held his brother's last breath. He turned to Ranger, who now stood still, head lowered. Elijah asked, "Did you see it happen?" Ranger didn't move. Elijah stood and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the torn-up ground, the ghosts of what had once been a secret training ground meant to break souls and rebuild obedience. He saw the shell of what had been a blast wall, now caved in. A stain of soot still painted the bark on a row of trees like shadow fingers reaching outward. He didn't need Jared's voice to understand, but the voice came anyway. From behind a tree stepped Jared, limping, bruised but alive. He held his side where blood soaked through his shirt, and his voice was hoarse. "It happened right there," he said, pointing to the center of the compound where moss now grew over cracked pavement. "I was on recon. Elijah Jr. and Ranger were running the corridor drill. There was a second handler, new green. Someone flipped the demo charges early. The structure was supposed to be clear." He paused, eyes dark. "It wasn't." Elijah said nothing. Jared continued. "The kid panicked, bolted. Your brother saw the charge trigger and dove, threw himself between the blast and the dog. Took the shrapnel full on. Ranger survived because Elijah Jr. used his own body to shield him." Jared's voice cracked. "They tried to erase it, said it was a training accident. No mention of sacrifice, no recognition. Just data loss and a directive to recondition the dog." Elijah knelt beside the broken badge again, his voice low and hollow. "Why not tell me then? Why erase everything?" "Because," Jared said, sitting against a tree to catch his breath, "if people knew these dogs could love, if they knew they could choose compassion over protocol, then command structure wouldn't mean a goddamn thing anymore." Ranger moved to Elijah Jr. Elijah placed a hand on his back, feeling the tremble under the fur, not of fear but of memory resurfacing from the edges of deletion. "You broke him," Jared said, "but they couldn't kill what your brother gave him. It's still in there, buried deep, sealed by pain but alive." Elijah looked up, eyes red. "So what do we do now?" Jared opened his palm and dropped a burned keycard onto Elijah's hand. "He's one more place left, the core, deep facility underground off GID. Echo's original mainframe. If any data survived, it's there. The memory core, the control schema, the full logs of what they really did. It's the last place they don't want you to go." Elijah studied the card, no numbers, no name. Just that damned cracked compass again. Ranger stood and barked once sharp, insistent. His body turned southwest, tail spoke. He knew the direction. He remembered the way. Elijah stood. Jared exhaled hard. "It's in the desert. You'll know it when you see it. Nothing but silence and regret holding up the roof. Ranger began walking. Elijah followed. Behind them, the trees closed like a wound, pretending it had never been opened. The sun had not yet risen when Elijah and Ranger reached the last marker, an outcropping of red stone halfway buried beneath sand, carved faintly with the compass symbol and a set of grooves only visible when touched with warmth. The keycard slid into a hidden slot behind the rock and unlocked a mechanical groan below the surface, a rusted plate sliding open to reveal stairs descending into the earth. They moved silently, boots and paws echoing against metal, as they stepped into what was once the core of Echo 9, the origin point of every lie, every manipulation, every erased name. The facility reeked of time and secrets, with overhead lights flickering like they hadn't been used in a decade, and walls lined with inactive monitors covered in dust. Ranger moved slowly now, not with fear but with familiarity, as though his steps were retracing memories he never asked to have. Elijah accessed the mainframe through Stillwell's passcode embedded in the envelope, triggering a cascade of restored data logs, biometric reports, and mission archives once thought deleted. And there, buried beneath layers of encryption, was the full footage of the final field deployment the day Elijah Jr. died. The video played in silence. It showed the blast, the chaos, the way Ranger stood frozen as shrapnel tore through the air, and how Elijah Jr. didn't hesitate to shield him. It showed the moment afterward, where Ranger, half-burned and whimpering, refused to leave the body even when handlers dragged him away. Elijah watched it all with clenched fists, jaw tight, eyes dry. There were no tears left, and a fury that felt like purpose. They left the compound before dusk, heading south toward the safe house coordinates Jared had given. But the calm didn't last. They were ambushed outside Jericho Ridge, a black site convoy already waiting along the ridge road. 2 SUVs, 3 operatives, and 1 man in a gray suit whose presence made Elijah's stomach knock. He recognized the man not from memory but from one of the blurred photos in Stillwell's files. He was part of the oversight committee, the people who had ordered Ranger's erasure and Elijah Jr.'s disappearance. There were no words exchanged, no negotiations, just the sound of safeties clicking off and boots crunching dry gravel. Elijah ducked behind the truck as the first shot rang out, and Ranger growled low and guttural, "Play off, stave shop." They moved as one, Ranger weaving through the perimeter as Elijah returned fire with a sidearm stolen from a dead operative weeks prior. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned. Elijah leaned against the fender, bleeding from a graze across his shoulder, breathing ragged. One of the soldiers closed in from the left flank, weapon raised. Elijah turned too slow, and that was when Ranger moved. The shepherd launched from behind the crates like a bullet, intercepting the shooter mid-stride, jaws clamped on the man's wrist, dragging him down with a snarl so feral it chilled the bones. But the second shooter was faster. A muzzle flash burst from the tree line, and Elijah could only watch, powerless, as the round hit Ranger in the side, knocking him off balance with a yelp that echoed like something breaking inside the earth itself. The Elijah screamed, stood, fired blindly toward the sound, then sprinted toward the dog now lying in the dirt, chests heaving, eyes unfocused but still searching for him. The remaining operatives retreated after that, not expecting resistance, not ready for conviction, and not willing to deal with witnesses. Elijah held Ranger in his arms as the blood spread beneath them. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no, you don't get to leave me, not like this." They made it to a medical trailer on the edge of Black Hollow an hour later. The woman inside was ex-military, owed Jared a favor, and didn't ask questions. She stitched Elijah's shoulder in silence, then focused on Ranger, who now lay on a cot wrapped in blankets, an IV in one leg, chest rising too slow. Elijah sat beside him all night, not sleeping, not moving, just watching. He played the same blues song Elijah Julier used to love on loop, low and gentle, like a lifeler saying. Ranger's ears twitched every time. The next morning the vet looked at him with sad eyes. "He's not in pain," she said. "But he's tired. Deep down, his body's running on something stronger than instinct. It's loyalty." Hours passed. Clouds rolled in. Rain tapped soft against the roof. Elijah sat beside Ranger, stroking the fur that had once stood tall in war zones, now matted with sweat and the memory of battles fought far beyond any handler's command. He leaned in close, voice barely a breath. "You didn't fail. You saved more than lives. You saved me." Ranger's eyes fluttered, heavy but still warm, still present. He tried to lift his head, muscles straining, and Elijah helped, cradling it gently as the dog rested against his chest. "You're not a broken thing," Elijah whispered. "You're not an experiment. You're not a weapon." His hand trembled on Ranger's shoulder. "You're my brother's legacy, and you're mine now. Your face." Ranger's breathing slowed. A shudder passed through his chest, and for a second, Elijah thought the moment had come. But then the dog opened his eyes once more, wet, glowing with that same familiar light, and looked at Elijah not like a soldier, not like a command, but like a soul returning home. Elijah smiled through clenched teeth. "You hear me, Ranger? You're not a number. You're not K991. You're my dog, and I'm proud of you." Ranger closed his eyes, a deep exhaled, the final one. Elijah stayed there, arms locked around him, forehead pressed to his, unmoving. Outside, the rain thickened, falling in long silver threads that washed the desert dust clean, as if the sky itself had decided to grieve. No alarms sounded, no sirens chased them, no shadows remained. Just the man, the memory, and a name whispered one last time into the still. Ranger. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more cinematic tales like it. Your support keeps these stories alive. What part hit you the hardest? Was it Ranger's final choice or Elijah's last words? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know where this story found you.